this the meeting of Standing Committee on Accountability and Oversight. We've got the Premier here today with some staff to talk to us about the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and what GNWT is going to do about that. So before we get started, I'll just get the members to introduce themselves because we are broadcasting the meeting. And just a reminder that if you have any questions or you want to speak, if you could just get my attention, we'll direct traffic through me so that Andrew knows which buttons to press as well for those that are going to speak. But we'll start on my left here with members. If they could introduce themselves, please.
Ron Bontrache, MLA Techo.
Rylan Johnson, MLA for Yellowknife North.
Richard and Jericon, MLA for Trinity Riding.
Semler, MLA for Nuvik Twin Lakes.
Jackie Jacobson, MLA for Nunavut.
Jane Whalen Armstrong, MLA for Mofi.
Frida Martzells, MLA for Tabacha.
Caitlin Cleveland Cam Lake.
Katrina Knockleby, Great Slave.
And myself, Kevin O'Reilly, I'm MLA for Frame Lake and chair of the Standing Committee on Accountability and Oversight. We've got some staff people that have joined us in the room as well. And I'm going to probably draw a blank here. Amy is our research support. Got Taylor Maxwell as well, that's helping us with the clerking. And Taylor does have the presentation up on the screen. And Madam Premier, when you're ready to move on the presentation, just let us know and Taylor can move that forward for you. And we have in the back Cynthia Cardinal, one of the clerks, and Kathleen Knuch, one of the researchers, and Mahalia Yakalaya Newmark as well. So lots of folks here because I think there's a lot of interest in the presentation today. I'm just going to start off by saying, Madam Premier, it would be a lot more helpful for us if we could get these presentations in advance. I understand that our staff only received this morning about 10 o'clock, 10:30 or something. So normally the process conventions require that we get material three days in advance. So it's just really helpful if we can get the material in advance so we can read it and, get better prepared for this. So I'm sure you'll do that in the future. But I'll turn it over to you, Madam Premier, to give some opening remarks and then a presentation. So please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I do apologize for the tardiness in getting the presentation. I can't guarantee, but we will work towards making sure that doesn't happen again in the future. I also want to thank you for the opportunity to discuss this important milestone in the implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People in the Northwest Territories. Joining me today are Martin Goldney, the Deputy Minister of the Department of Executive and Indigenous Affairs, Anne-Marie Gaydo, the Manager of Indigenous Affairs from the Department of EIA, may be joining us. She was supposed to be here, we're not sure, so she may come join in. And my Ministerial Special Advisor, Ali Kincaid. I look forward to answering your questions on the progress we have made in our work with Indigenous governments. Concluding this Memorandum of Understanding is an important step towards our government's mandate priority to implement the United Nations Declaration. While this work may have not advanced as quickly as we might have liked, we believed it was critical to work with the Indigenous government partners on their timelines. This was necessary work, and I believe we're better positioned to see meaningful action as a result of our shared efforts. Consensus, Mr. Chair, is hard work, as you may all appreciate. And even now, we have Indigenous governments expressing various levels of support. But we're all glad that there is a very positive momentum and a clear willingness to advance our work in the life of this Assembly. The Memorandum of Understanding formalizes an ongoing relationship with Indigenous governments to support the long-term work of implementing the United Nations Declaration, which must be done in collaboration and in cooperation with Indigenous governments. This work with Indigenous governments has been done in a way that recognizes their understanding and priorities. This is consistent with the requirements for the government in the Northwest Territories set out in the United Nations Declaration when undertaking implementation. We are expecting this work to be guided by legislation that is expected to soon be put before the Assembly for consideration. Together, the MOU and legislation are important pieces of work that I hope will prove to be valuable guides for our government as we work collaboratively with Indigenous governments in advancing reconciliation. Through you, Mr. Chair, if you approve, I'd like to turn it over to Ms. Martin Goldney from the Department of Executive Indigenous Affairs to deliver a presentation on the Memorandum of Understanding.
Okay, thanks, Madam Premier. Yeah, I think we've got the presentation up on the screen, and Mr. Goldney, if you'd like to proceed with it, that'd be great. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If we can just go to the first slide. So just very quickly, the presentation is laid out with just a bit of an overview of what the mandate commitment was respecting UNDRIP, a little bit of background on how we organized ourselves to do this work collaboratively with Indigenous governments, and then just a quick walkthrough with some of the key features of the MOU and anticipated next steps. So next slide, please. So I'm sure, as members will recall, this was one of the priorities set by the Assembly, was to work on further implementing UNDRIP. And as the Premier mentioned, we did recognize early on that this had to be done in collaboration with Indigenous governments. So a lot of our early work was really about setting ourselves up and positioning ourselves to have that conversation in a way that made sense with our Indigenous government partners. Next slide, please. What we said we'd do is establish terms of reference, establish a working group. We were optimistic, perhaps, that we would begin focusing on a work plan or implementation plan that will help guide further work. And then we recognize that there should be some ongoing reporting related to UNDRIP. We were very careful when we were setting some of this up early on not to be too prescriptive about what UNDRIP implementation might look like in the Northwest Territories. So for example, you did not see in that demonstration of project a commitment to having this done as other jurisdictions have done through legislation. We wanted to have that conversation with Indigenous governments first. Next slide, please. So along with this work, I think members are aware a strong focus for our department and our government has been to strengthen the relationship with Indigenous governments. So that did involve having some conversations about how we'd like to organize ourselves to work together. And one way we've done that is establishing the NWT Council of Leaders as a space where Indigenous leaders and the government of the Northwest Territories can come together and talk about shared priorities. Not surprisingly, UNDRIP quickly emerged as something that we should be working together on, and we did organize ourselves to do that through an officials working group that also plugged into Indigenous government leadership along the way. And we thought the best way to do that was taking advantage of the Council of Leaders structure. Next slide, please. So there was a terms of reference for the working group that was approved by the Council of Leaders. It really did describe the roles of the officials working on this, emphasize that we're going to try and do this work to the extent we can based on consensus. And we reached that terms of reference in the summer of 2022. There was, of course, still work happening in the background as well, so we weren't starting fresh from that point, but it was one of the milestones along the way. Next slide, please. So the working group has really been focused on three key items. Happily, we can report completion on them. So mention the terms of reference, the MOU, which we'll talk about a little bit more, But we've also, of course, been working on a legislative framework that will inform, or has informed, a legislative proposal that will inform a bill, with the expectation that that will be brought before the Assembly for further consideration. So all of that work has been happening in the background, so we're glad that we're at a point now where we can lift the veil and share some of that good work. Next slide, please. So just very quickly on the MOU, and I will say one of the things that we quickly determined when we were working with Indigenous groups or governments, there wasn't unanimity on the best approach for advancing UNDRIP. There wasn't a clear consensus that legislation should be the first focus. So what we did was work with all of our Indigenous government partners, and where we could agree was let's try and do both, but let's also have a formalized MOU that will at least give everybody the comfort that we were sincere about our efforts to advance this work and committing to do it collaboratively, and that work has always been imagined as an ongoing conversation. I think, as everybody appreciates, UNDRIP is not a one and done deal. It really is about resetting the relationship and working collaboratively together to move things forward. And there was agreement that an MOU to help articulate that would be helpful as an additional guide. So next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the MOU was developed with Indigenous governments through the officials working group. So all the Indigenous governments operate according to their own rules and structures, but it was helpful to have officials working on this and then bring it back collectively to the leadership, which happened on November 29th, 2022, so relatively recently, but it was satisfying to see that there was that shared momentum to move this forward across all of our governments. And at the same time, as I mentioned, there were still discussions happening on a legislative framework for what has now helped inform a legislative proposal, which will soon result in a bill. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned, one of the rationale for having an MOU is to demonstrate that shared commitment to continue these conversations. Whatever happens with the bill, there will still be an MOU to help guide the parties moving forward. And we thought that was important to signal and document as a commitment that will continue to carry forward. Next slide, please. So some of the recitals in the MOU are familiar for anybody that's kind of looked at UNDRIP, and so they do just emphasize again or highlight what the intention is for the UN Declaration as a universal framework setting the minimum standards for Indigenous peoples in the Northwest Territories and around the world. It does represent a commitment to continue working collaboratively with Indigenous governments in the territory, and notes that part of our ongoing implementation focus should be on improving the lives of the Indigenous residents in our territory. Next slide, please. So there is a purpose section of the MOU, which again, a consistent theme throughout is collaboration and working with Indigenous governments. So here's another place where we identify that we are committed to working in collaboration with Indigenous governments on the development of a legislative framework. I should just pause here to note that the MOU, the sequence for the MOU was slightly in advance of some of this other work, but we're very happy to report that some of this good momentum has carried forward, and the legislative framework has been collaboratively developed with our Indigenous government partners. Some of the more forward facing work that's still to be done is an action plan. So there's a commitment and recognition that we still have that work to undertake with our Indigenous government partners, guided by an MOU and potentially further guided by some legislation as well. Next slide, please. So the working group is to make consensus recommendations. So there have been a number of meetings with officials, dozens in fact, where this has been a really active working group with various levels of participation at various times from Indigenous governments, appreciating that many might still have some capacity issues. So we do try and work respectfully with all of our Indigenous government partners. And the result of that has been shared recommendations on how to advance UNDRIP in the territories, how to further advance implementation. As the Premier mentioned, consensus takes work, and it takes time. It's not always easy to achieve, so we've had to make space to have some of those conversations. But I think it's also, we all recognize that unanimity might not always be achievable, but the goal is to get as much consensus and support for this important work moving forward as we can. It also talks about the potential to continue conversations even outside of legislation, outside of existing mechanisms. Let's keep our thinking caps on and consider ways to continue to operationalize consent-based decision-making in the work that we do where it affects Indigenous government. So more to come on that. Next slide, please. So there is a recognition in the MOU of the role and responsibilities of Indigenous governments, a commitment for the co-development of measures, including let's sit down and identify what pieces of legislation would benefit from an analysis and an UNDRIP lens collectively, and the further development of recommendations for the NWT Council of Leaders for ministerial decision sharing agreements and the potential for there to be further conversations directly with Indigenous governments about how ministerial decisions are made and how they might be done collaboratively with Indigenous governments. So that is a piece that is going to require more work and more discussions, but we wanted to acknowledge that there is potential for that to happen, and we've seen that model applied in at least one Canadian jurisdiction and as a feature of their legislation. Next slide, please. So again, this is really about supporting the implementation of the UN Declaration in the NWT's context. There is acknowledgement that this work should support our efforts to address the calls to action and the calls to justice in the TRC and the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls reports, and recognition that the UN Declaration should help serve our reconciliation efforts and provide an additional framework for us to be guided by. Next slide, please. So there's principles there. Again, one of the values of having the MOU is it gives an opportunity for not just the GNWT but Indigenous governments to state their commitment to collaborative implementation and doing this work. We also heard from Indigenous governments, and we thought it was important to reflect as well, that we should acknowledge that Aboriginal and treaty rights agreements should be upheld and respected, and their implementation is also part of this conversation around reconciliation. And sometimes it's a little different in interest from what some of the other members of the Indigenous government participants in the Council of Leaders might have. There might be different priorities, but we wanted to recognize that context and acknowledge that as a reality in the NWT. Next slide, please. So there are some guidelines. So we do expect all members to be participating actively and have representatives. As I mentioned, we're striving to take a consensus approach in this work. The expectation is there's going to be continuing regular meetings of the working group, and each party, while bearing their costs, it is recognized that the GNWT may be called upon for additional support as may be required. Next slide, please. And we do encourage all of our working group members, as I might have mentioned earlier, each Indigenous government has their own processes and their own accountabilities for decision making. But the expectation is that this isn't a working group that goes away and does its work and then surprises the Council of Leaders or Indigenous leadership. That organizations are reporting back and advancing and raising issues that might require political intervention as may be required. Working group membership isn't just completely inflexible. We do also acknowledge that at times there would be a need to have some observers and other participants in the discussion, so that is acknowledged as well. And the expectation is set that there should be regular updates of the work of this working group to the Council of Leaders. So next slide, please. So there is a term for 4 years. Of course, our hope is that this MOU will continue to prove useful. This isn't meant to suggest that the work related to implementing UNDRIP is going to be done in 4 years. We do want to acknowledge that there is going to be an ongoing effort required. And of course, the MOU may be renewed periodically, may be amended by mutual consent, and members can withdraw if they feel that's best for their organizations. And I think that's about it, but next slide, please. There's a list here of the governments that have currently signed on to the MOU. So you can see that we're continuing to build some momentum and support for this work. Next slide, please. So we're not standing still with this work. We're happy to have the benefit of the MOU to guide us, but there is a working group meeting, and we're going to start turning our attention more directly to the things that we can do to build an action plan. Mentioned the legislative proposal, so looking forward to that work advancing as well, and that complementing this conversation so we can continue to move forward in a positive way. We know that there are still some governments considering signing on to the MOU, so we will continue that engagement and look forward to having some more discussions there as well. And all Indigenous governments are invited to participate in the working group. And I think that concludes the presentation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thanks for that presentation. I think what we'll do is one round of questions for members, and maybe I'll just go around the table, I think, and let everybody have an opportunity to ask a question. And then I think there may be some questions and discussion that we'd like to do in camera about this arrangement. So why don't we start that way? And so I'd like to start with Mr. Bonnet Rouge, and we'll just go around the room that way, I think.
Merci, Mr. Chair. Merci to the Premier and her staff for presenting to us. I've been hearing rumblings, and I think it is at the Dinner Nation leadership meeting this past summer, that there was concern with Article 46 of the agreement, of the UNDRIP, I should say. I'm just wondering if you're aware of that, and if you could try to explain to me what 46 is actually saying too, if you can do that. Merci.
Okay, thanks, Emily Bonnet Rouge. I'll go to the Premier, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We thought we were on the process, so if you can give us a moment, we're trying to find the actual United Nations Declaration, because
we'll just give them a, it's a good question. We'll just want to make, if you have Article 46 in front of you, and maybe you want to summarize it, Mr. Bonnet Rouge, that might help give a little bit more context.
I think it's got 3 parts to Article 46. I think it could be number 2, I'm not certain, but in the exercise of the rights enunciated in the present declaration, human rights and fundamental freedoms of all shall be respected. The exercise of the rights set forth in this declaration shall be subject only to such limitations as are determined by law and in accordance with international human rights obligations. Any such limitations shall be non-discriminatory and strictly necessary solely for the purpose of securing due recognition and respect for the rights and freedoms of others, and for meeting the just and most compelling requirements of a democratic society. Well, number 1 goes on to say that nothing in this declaration may be interpreted as implying for any state, people, group, or person any right to engage in any activity or to perform any act contrary to the Charter of the United Nations, or construed as authorizing or encouraging any action which would dismember or impair totally or in part the territorial integrity or political unity of sovereign and independent states. And the third one says the provisions set forth in this declaration shall be interpreted in accordance with the principles of justice, democracy, respect for human rights, equality, non-discrimination, good governance, and good faith. Well, I'm just wondering what would be the big concern there from what I've read anyways. Yeah, let's see.
Okay, thanks. I'll go to the Premier, please.
Ms. Chow, start, and then if staff want to add on, that's fine. So there's a couple of things within that. The United Nations Declaration for Indigenous People is not something that was done by the GNWT or even Canada. It's done by the United Nations. I think if we wanted to change that, that would be a huge process, and I'm not even sure if it's doable. So, and Martin can expand on that if you want, but I don't think it's something that we can actually change. The direction, the priority was to implement the United Nations Declaration is what we're doing. And I do know that there was discussion at the tables with the council leaders, though, on these things. So it wasn't that there was no discussion. However, Dene Nation is not a member of the Council of Leaders, and so I have not heard their concerns personally. There will be a process that, it'll be legislative proposal comes now. I'm guessing that standing committee will take it on the road. There'll be public engagement, and then when those concerns are brought forward. But that's my understanding. Martin, did you have anything you want to add on there?
Go ahead, Deputy Minister, please.
Thank you. Maybe just briefly, we didn't mention it, but we are undertaking this work, as the Premier said. This is an exercise in implementing the existing declaration. We don't believe that we've got the space to revise that through this discussion. This really is about implementing this legislation, and it's about doing it within the existing Canadian constitutional framework. So that's another guidepost that we have. If an Indigenous people has different aspirations for what their sovereignty looks like, and want to suggest that that is sovereignty outside of the nation state of Canada, we obviously can't participate in those types of discussions. That's for those peoples to pursue separately. So we are very much focused on implementing this through the existing Canadian constitutional framework. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for that. I'm just going to go around the table. Mr. Johnson, please.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, we're 3.5 years in, and we've got an MOU to start a plan that not even all groups signed, and you know, we hopefully will get some legislation, which I imagine will just commit us to creating a plan. So I think any person on the ground is still quite a few years from seeing anything actually change in their life. And I recognize the difficulties of trying to get every single Indigenous group in the territory to agree on anything. Good luck with that. But I'm just curious if the Premier has any comments. You know, in hindsight, what would we have done differently, or what perhaps some are lessons learned for our next government in trying to do something like this? I think it's fair to say that, you know, clearly this is not the timeline anyone was hoping for. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Johnson. Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I mean, in hindsight, what we would have done differently, maybe in the government before this government, we might have started the council leaders where we had all Indigenous governments at the table. So that in itself was a process that this government had to take on, and those things take time. We did talk about the, because I was worried about consensus and what that meant, so we actually have it within the terms of reference in the council leaders, and we talked about it specifically around this as well. So I'd like to read out from the, recognizing you don't have the council leaders terms of reference, but if you'd allow, I'd like to read out the decision-making piece of that, and we can provide this to you later if committee wants.
Thanks, Madam Premier. I think we've seen it. Is that actually a public document?
Yes.
Okay, all right, great. Sure, if you want to quote from it briefly, and it'll help you answer the question, please go ahead.
Because it was a discussion, because some people felt the MOU wasn't necessary, some felt that we need to go right into legislation, some felt the legislation wasn't necessary, so we weren't going to get everyone on board. So 8.1 within the decision-making for the council leaders says, the NWT council leaders shall strive to carry out its decisions by consensus, if consensus is not possible by majority vote of the members. Although consensus is desired, unanimity, I said that wrong, but on any one issue is not required to advance action on that issue. And Mr. Chair, that was the discussion that we had in regards to this work. So we went back to this terms of reference, and they still upheld it. That I think they all recognize that we're not going to get everyone on board for every issue. So it's a matter of the majority vote. I think similar within our own house. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thanks. Mr. Jericon, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Premier, for your update. And I'm just thinking, we've been around. I mean, I've been around for a while in different politics and that kind of thing. But I remember going through the days of Northern Accord, and then that was later changed to the Aboriginal Summit, and later on, and now we're talking about the evolution that was later on after the Aboriginal Summit days. What I'm thinking is that now that we went through these processes and stages, the goal at the end of the day for the territorial government at the time, and probably still is today, is that they want to have provincial-like powers. So when devolution was signed, it gave them, it's basically your land claim. That's what people call it. you know, and, but yet there's still claims that are outstanding and that needs to be resolved. So, even though that we have, this MOU here and the people are involved in this whole thing, but at the end of the day, you know, the goal here is to really implement the UNDRIP, recommendations that were put forward, but at the same time, sooner or later, I don't know if it came up in your discussions, but I think it's something that needs to be brought up as well, is that the mandate of this government going forward, though, is that we're going to have to start recognizing that we got constitutional protected land claim agreements. And also we need to look at how we're all going to work together and coexist. And so sooner or later, we're going to have to start talking about a constitutional agreement or something like that at the end of the day, because you know, it's not, you know, there's no place around the world that, you know, are talking like that. So it's something that we need to really take a look at now, because again, you know, it's you know, we got $2.2 billion budget. You know, Jim Burke made some great contributions in the Jim Burke report, and made some really good recommendations, but that's sitting in the shelf downstairs and it's not going anywhere. So I'm thinking that that should be looked at. But anyway, again, I'm not privileged to be part of the working group. I know Lisa sits there. But at the same time, I'll be talking to the chiefs in my riding and get their input on this as well, because at the end of the day, I'm going to have to work with them as well on this. So anyway, I just want to leave that there. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Jericon. Madam Premier, any response?
Yeah, thanks. There was a lot in that, but yeah, I mean, we do need to work towards what the future will look like. You know, how we work together as public government with Indigenous governments when the land claims are done. There was stark recognition, even within the United Nations Declaration for Indigenous People and at the Council leaders, that we need to respect the treaty rights within this work. So that's there. I think the difference between many groups. You know, because like you said, you've named groups that you've seen and experienced that I haven't even heard about, but, you know, and they keep changing. I think the big difference with this is that this is going to be a legislative act. This is going to be something that is legal and that we have to abide by. So, and it does, within the act, the legislative proposal, once the bill comes forward, there will be, you know, a working committee, an action committee to develop the action, and it's not just by the GNWT. That action group committee will be with the members of that are working on this, of the Indigenous governments, all which are welcome to join on, and the GNWT, but not us defining. And there will be a framework. There'll be roles and responsibilities. So yes, I agree that we have a lot more work to do, but I also think that we need to take time and celebrate that this legislative assembly, not just EIA, this legislative assembly made this work a priority. And this is the first step towards getting to where I think you want to see us be. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thanks. Mrs. Semler, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Just to clarify, I'm not part of the working group. I don't sit at the council leaders. I've been a guest a couple of times, but my question is more related around this implementation. You know, if we talk about UNDRIP, so this act, you know, it's going to come before this House. And just from what I've heard from past MLAs that have sat in the last government, I mean, there was that, and then the governments before with I think it was the MVRMA, when they collaborated and worked together with Indigenous groups to create this. But the regular MLAs, and I sit as a regular MLA now, so if I was in cabinet, I don't know, if I'd never been a regular MLA, how that difference would be. So for as a regular MLA, if this legislation is given to us and we only have so much time left in this government, but we haven't been able to be in the loop of what the discussions and what's going on, or even having some feedback of to how is it going to work for our government to be passing this type of legislation, it's kind of hard to throw it on us. If it's not going to be now, it'll be in May, June, because it's not going to be in the last week in August. So if it's coming before us in May, June, there's going to be a lot of work that's going to have to get done and updates with regular MLAs so that we can move this along. So is this something that the Premier and her staff are willing to be working with regular MLAs? So not only with the Indigenous governments on this act and with us, so that we're able to move this along in a positive way, collaboratively, all together. Thanks.
Thanks, Ms. Summer. I think you might have stolen my question, but go ahead, Madam Premier.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'll start, and then again, if staff want to just put your hand up for me. Yeah, so like I said, when we first provided this information to committee, it was as an MOU. We progressed from there, working all together with the Indigenous governments to a legislative proposal. We're already starting on the back page of actually looking at proposed drafts. I mean, that work goes on. But my understanding, and I'm open to correction if I'm wrong, because procedures are something we're all starting to figure out, is that we will be proposing to submit the proposed bill in this session, February, March. You will have the proposed bill. I'm going to say that. Okay. Yes. Yes. And you will have the required 120 days to take it on the road, and I'm assuming that you will. I'm shocked if you don't, although I'm not to tell you what to do. And then once that feedback is brought forward, and then we'll do the process as normal. Of course, the recommendations, it's going to be a little bit tight because I also have a commitment to bring that back to the council leaders for their input. But we are seeing that this bill will follow the normal legislative process in the House, with the exception that the council leaders will be included in the work, because that's always the variable that we're dealing with. In fairness, though, if this bill is produced, and I know that the clerk's office is already working on how do we add Indigenous governments within legislative proposals. That's work that's ongoing. This is the way. I mean, this was a priority of all of us, and this will be the way of the future. So these questions you bring up are going to be impacted as we go forward. But you're going to have enough time to take it on the road. Good.
Okay, we'll see. MLA Jacobson?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. No, just in regards, I'm really happy to hear you're making headway with this, but I'm really surprised today that Innivalid hasn't signed on, where usually we're one of the first to try in betterment of our people in regards to working with everybody to try for the common good. So I'm really surprised that they're not signed on, and I guess I don't know if she's allowed to answer in a public forum, or do I have to wait till in camera? But thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Jacobson. If the Premier wants to answer at a high level or something, or just want to leave that for later, whatever, Premier, it's your call.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. What I'd like to say at a high level is that some Indigenous governments wanted this as the first step. Some Indigenous governments wanted to avoid this and just do the proposed bill. Some Indigenous governments didn't want anything to do with it. The individual Indigenous governments' feedback, though, I'd prefer in camera. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good way to handle that. Thank you. I'll go over to Ms. Whalen Armstrong, please.
Thank you. You talked about working in partnership with Indigenous government or Indigenous organizations. Can we get an update on the three outstanding group that did not, or the three outstanding land claims, or the Gwich'in, Decho, Decho and Quechua and Métis, and that did not sign on yet? Can we get an update on where they're at right now? For the land claims, yes. They didn't sign their land. Just to get an update on what's the status? Where are they at right now?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, let's not use the terminology claims if we can avoid it. It's really quite colonial. So, where are the negotiations at? I guess with these three Indigenous governments, maybe you could just kind of tell us at a high level. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, again, the negotiations, whether they're for land or self-government, are three parties, and there is a level of confidentiality around that. So either we do that in camera or a separate presentation to committee, but it is not to be public at this point. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, no, thanks. I appreciate that. Yeah, I think we have to respect the confidentiality of those negotiations. So, I'll move on to Ms. Martsalis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess my question is, why is, there was a group of Indigenous governments that signed on to the Intergovernmental Council, which was quite a process with devolution. And all of a sudden now we seem to be moving away from those that have signed on and had a special agreement, and going on to the leader of council. To me, some of the groups that haven't signed on are the Intergovernmental Council, Government Council. And that might, I'm just wondering if that is one of the barriers to this MOU. And an MOU anyways is just an MOU. It's really, you're not binding on anything, so there's a situation there that concerns me as a former leader, because I'm talking about the two reserves, I'm talking about the Inuvialuit, and two of the main groups in my area, the NWT Métis Nation and also the Salt River First Nation, are both of my Indigenous groups, and they're both part of the Intergovernmental Council. Signing on to something that is not binding is a question, especially when they signed on to something that was more binding when they decided to sign on to the devolution agreement. There seems to be a disconnect there, and I just want to see the rationale with that. Because this government seems to be always calling on the Council of Leaders. You have more meetings with Council of Leaders than you have with the Intergovernmental Council. Okay? And, and I also would like to you're going to bring a bill in now and try to start the deadline for making sure that we go on to UNDRIP which is a must in, but I would like to know how long that's going to be. Like, is it going to be in this government? I don't think so. Is it going to be in the next government? I bet you not. Is it the following that? I will be dead by the time this comes to fruition. And I'm just wondering the thinking behind this, because I know how slow things go. Salt River now is signed on in 2001. It's 21 years later, and they still haven't got the implementation of the claim with all their conditions. And, some of those things are not to be proud of, because government works too slow. And it's not only the federal government, it's the territorial government too that's always holding back. And look at the NWT Métis claim. Even that one, it's questionable. So those are some of the things that come to mind, because I know how slow things work in a room. One word, you could spend all day on one word. And most of the times the will is not there. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Ms. Martsalis. I'll turn to the Premier, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the member is correct. I mean, not all, and as stated earlier, not all Indigenous governments have signed on to the MOU. An MOU is not binding. I mean, it's a goodwill statement, basically, although they are working on the legislative proposal and the draft bill. So, however, in saying that the devolution agreement, or the devolution groups, the Intergovernmental Council, was strictly around land and resources. Everyone is invited to sign on, not all did. The council leaders, but when that happened, and even in my last term as a minister, I heard the complaints from Indigenous governments that weren't in the devolution. And I also heard when I went to the Intergovernmental Council, when people want to talk about housing or medical travel or other issues, they were always said, this is about land and resources. This is not about everything. So the members themselves wanted a different forum that everyone can be included, that they can talk about housing, medical travel, anything that they wanted besides land and resources. That's why, Mr. Chair, I almost called you Madam, we started the council leaders so that all areas, everyone could be invited and be members, and everything could be discussed. In fact, we're working on housing policies at this very moment. The members, though, I should state, and again, you've got this, a public document, for the council leaders has the Akudene Ko First Nation, the Akecho Dene First Nation, the Decho First Nation, the Delenigotene Government, the Gwich'in Tribal Council, the Inuvialuit Regional Corporation, Katladeche First Nation, Nahanibut Dene Band, North Slave Métis Alliance, the NWT Métis Nation, Sawtooth Secretariat Incorporated, Salt River First Nation, the Clecho Government, and the GNWT. All these Indigenous governments and ourselves are members of the Council of Leaders. So this is pretty comprehensive. It's different than the Intergovernmental Council, and these are all signed into the Council of Leaders group. So again, the Council of Leaders is way more inclusive than the Intergovernmental Council. They'll talk about lots, but not all of them wanted to do this process. Some didn't want the MOU, some wanted to just go towards the draft legislation, some didn't even want to recognize it at the time. So there was different reasons, but all members have signed on to the terms of reference for the Council leaders. I hope that answered the question. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thanks, Madam Premier. Ms. Cleveland?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the presentation. I also wanted to take this opportunity just to say thank you to the members of the Special Committee on Reconciliation and Indigenous Affairs, because I know that and respect that there's a need for privacy in some of their committees, but in some of the committee meetings that they did have, I had the opportunity to sit and listen to my colleagues, and it was a really good opportunity for me to be able to learn from colleagues that I have a tremendous amount of respect for the experience they bring to the table. So I just wanted to say thank you to my colleagues for that as well. My question is, I look back at what the goal is, and the goal is, and the intent, is to ensure the implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and to contribute to the calls to action for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, calls to justice for MMIWG. And when I think of this work that's happening and think of what is concurrently happening within the GNWT, there's a lot of important work that's happening right now. And one of the things that we know about a government is if they've just opened up something, they're not going to turn around and open it up right away again. And I think of things like the renewal that's happening at housing with all of their policies right now. And I think of the review that's just happened with income assistance at education, culture, and employment. And my concern is that there are policies that exist that have unintended consequences and that could not stand up to the calls to action, or calls to justice, for the MMIWG, and the calls to action for the TRC. And so how is the work of this framework making sure that the work being done in those other departments can stand up to those tests and stand up to the test of, ultimately, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples? Because really the goal is about autonomy, respect, equity, and really actually true fairness. Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Cleveland. Over to the Premier.
Thanks. I'm looking forward to the easy question at the end. No. Yeah, good points. There's a few things, and you're right. I mean, things do take time. Although this act commits us to working with the implementation committee, it defines the roles and responsibilities that each person will have. It provides a framework when the act is coming, the draft bill, for the implementation of the work to go on. There's things that were provided in the legislative proposal that will help guide that. We're not saying that, because you're right, I mean, we've got acts in the Legislative Assembly that are like at least 30 years old. So what we're proposing within this is that new legislation that comes forward would be reviewed by the Attorney General. Will provide the legislative with any new GNWT legislation a statement of consistency to ensure that new laws are consistent with the United Nations Declaration. We'll also provide for a process in the action plan to guide the review and amendment of existing legislation, regulations, and policies to ensure compliance. New laws will be easier to make sure they comply. Old ones will take time. There's no doubt about that. There's also, we'll be looking at a public review, including an annual public report and a public review of the report. I could go on, but basically what I'm saying, Mr. Chair, is the member's right. We're not going to be able to do everything in one day. This is giving the act that says any new acts will be considered and will work together towards reviewing previous acts and policies. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thanks. I guess it's my turn, so, well, a little bit. Yeah, I am concerned about the amount of time that is going to be available in the rest of this assembly to do, review this bill, because I have no idea what it's going to contain. I think I've got some inkling in it that it's going to be looks like something similar to what BC has done. But if it's starting to verge on constitutional development, if we're going to start talking about Indigenous governments co-drafting all legislation or having the ability to look at, amendments and all kinds of things, that we're starting to get into some interesting territory that is verging on constitutional development. So I'm a bit hesitant to try to do this very quickly. I don't think your MOU has even been released to the public yet. It's not a public document as far as I'm aware. And, where and when does the public get an opportunity to have input other than through the standing committee review that's supposed to take place in 120 days? If we're talking about significant constitutional development, that's not a way to do significant constitutional development. So I'd like to get some assurance that that's not what this is about. If this is about implementation of UNDRIP, that's probably okay. But if we're talking about constitutional development, that's a whole different kettle of fish. So that's part one. Part two, if I can squeeze in another part, is what is going to be the role for regular MLAs in all of this? Like regular MLAs, we are already feeling squeezed out you've got a whole series of bilateral arrangements with Indigenous governments. Some MLAs sometimes get to sit in on some of these, but, there are significant problems with the co-development process that we have now for resource management legislation. I tabled a letter in the Legislative Assembly yesterday on this, identifying that there are really significant inconsistencies with the way that different departments are approaching this, the kind of information that's shared with standing committee, that nobody's really advocating advocating for public participation. Our government has that duty or responsibility, but is not fulfilling it, in my view. So anyways, sorry, there's a couple of things there. What's going to, is this going to be constitutional development? And what is going to be the role for regular MLAs? Why even have MLAs in the future if this is going to be a negotiated arrangement with Indigenous governments? So that's my concern, and trying to do all this in three months, it's not going to work. But okay, go ahead. Thanks.
This one I am going to start, and then I'm going to pull in Martin to either correct me or expand or just say that's good. Okay. For clarification, the legislative proposal, how we're seeing the draft bill, will not have something that says that Indigenous governments will have say over every single act. I mean, that is the discussion that we're having, that, that Legislative Assembly is looking at. This act is not looking at that. This act is saying that whenever new acts come, that we will do our due diligence and make sure, and I'm expecting that MLAs would be part of that process, that we'll make sure that the United Nations Declaration, which is really quite broad, is being thought about within that. It's just like when we do the gender-based analysis that we're doing. Those kind of things that we do as a government, climate change, looking at those things. So it's the same kind of an idea, but it won't say that every single act shall have to get approved by the Indigenous governments. So it's really about making sure that we think about the United Nations Declaration as we move forward on it. It's going to provide a framework for the implementation of how our programs, so Indigenous governments will sit around and members will have a say in that, I'm presuming, in the next government, because it won't start until the next government, that members will have a say in, but, how programs are delivered. Medical travel, housing, things that are very contentious with Indigenous governments and community people. So I'm hopeful that the next government would hold that would want to say in that, because you already have a say in that, and I don't see that disappearing. And then the third part is just the roles and responsibilities of each of the working group, the action, what will happen. So, but I'll ask Martin if he, around the constitutional, because I might have mashed that all up. Martin, through the chair, if the chair is all right.
Please go ahead, thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And yeah, we think we're being very careful to be, as I mentioned, part of this work has to be done and should be acknowledged that we're doing this within the constitutional framework that we have, and that constitutional framework includes a public government in the Northwest Territories with that democratic accountability for some of these, some of the actions of governments. We're always very mindful that we can't step out of bounds with those requirements. So what we imagine happening as a result of this work is some of the work for the executive branch of government when it is developing policies or developing legislation will include that lens of UNDRIP and conversations with Indigenous governments, as the Premier mentioned, for some pieces, but not all. There will be an expectation that we're working collaboratively. So at the end of the day, what we hope to happen is when we get that work done and it's time for the Legislative Assembly to see a bill and MLAs to dispose of what is proposed, that they have the benefit of some of that input from Indigenous governments and the confidence that what's being proposed lines up with UNDRIP, lines up with what Indigenous governments understand to be required of UNDRIP, and ideally that makes it easier and not harder at the end. That is the goal. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thanks. So we've had one round of questions from all the members, and I think there's some interesting discussion that's taken place, but I think we're at a point now where there's some matters that we would like to go in camera to discuss with the Premier and the staff. So can I get a motion to go in camera, please? Ms. Semler, no objections? All right, we're now going to go in camera, and we'll just take a short 5-minute break so everybody can get refreshed. And I'd like to thank anybody who's been watching live, and this will be recorded, so thanks for anybody who is interested in this topic, and pay attention, there's more coming. Thanks.